the first time we met? I was thinking about this as I prepped for this episode. I think so. What's your memory? What's your
memory? It was Sierra Club office.
Yes, that's right. With Robert Harris.
Yeah.
We should have Robert Harris on the podcast. Yeah, Robert was the head of the Hawaii chapter of the Sierra Club for our listeners. And he was recruiting me into becoming a citizens lobbyist. And I imagined that this representative, Chris Lee, was going to show up and be like every other legislator, an older Asian man. And instead, you were a young Asian man that showed up and provided a really compelling vision for community engagement on then clean energy. How did you become a legislator far before the time of your colleagues?
I don't really remember how it happened. It was so like, it was a blur. And then all of a sudden I was elected. But I remember growing up before that, having never wanted to actually do anything like this, never wanted to be the face of anything. I was the kid that sat in the back of the classroom. I was a C student at best on a good day. And was never in student government or speech and debate or any of that stuff. And I was happy being like the quiet policy wonky type, doing my own thing. And the guy in my area retired, and I was doing an internship at the Capitol at the time for another representative, which I just needed, frankly, because I needed credits to finish my degree, which was poli-sci. The only reason it was poli-sci was because that was the fastest way out of college at that point, because it was my junior year. My parents were like, so what are you declaring? Because this gravy train is not going to last forever. You're going to have to do something here. So I just sort of like kind of happenstanced into the policy arena. And a couple of years after doing some of the policy work behind the scenes, working for other people, the guy in my area retired. And so this guy, Scott Psyche, who's now the Speaker of the House in Hawaii, who I worked for at the time, said, well, you have to run. Like, you're born in the area, you know the issues, you care about your community, you're doing all the policy stuff already. You might as well step up and make your voice heard. And I thought, that's kind of hilarious. No, thank you. And after months and months of arm twisting, I realized, like, all right, if I don't do this, someone else is going to, and they're probably going to be arguably on the more terrible side. So I should at least try. And at the very end, if things don't work out, which I fully expected, then I can sleep well at night.
How many people since then have you had that same conversation with, convincing them to run?
I haven't thought about that. The irony is probably a dozen or more.
Yeah, I know. I was like, including myself, you tried to convince me to run at some time.
Sometimes successfully, sometimes not.
What does it take to get elected? I mean, we can only speak here in Hawaii, although I know you work on national campaigns too. What does it take?
Yeah, no, but I think it's universal. Like, no matter where you're at, Hawaii, Indiana, Florida, like, doesn't matter. And I think it's true in other democracies outside our country as well, because ultimately running an election and convincing other people to vote for you or what you believe in or what it is you want to achieve together is the same formula. It appeals to basic human psychology and a desire for change, or at the very least a desire to end frustration that people are feeling and be able to just put that all on somebody else and say, you know what, go fix it. And so I think what it really takes is certainly a dedication and a willingness to know that your private life as you know it will come to an end, and everything you do will be to an extent scrutinized. And that's the price you got to pay in order to get elected and then be able to make some of these decisions at key moments.
Wow, you make it sound so attractive.
But you get to make some really important decisions at key moments that can have a lasting impact. And despite like all the frustration and, banging your head against a wall at the system and all that, everyone I've talked to who's run for office and who's been in it for a little while, when they have that one victory, and you lose 9 out of 10, maybe 99 out of 100 battles you fight, But when you have that one, you've done something and you've changed something, and all that effort you put in and all that desire and want for change and everything else that everyone has heaped onto you suddenly becomes worthwhile because you did it for something bigger than yourself. Nobody I know runs for office because they want a fat paycheck, which doesn't really exist in the public sector, or because they want to go through frustration and pain and agony and deal with people who are angry all the time because they can never make everyone happy. You do it because you can actually do something that's worthwhile. And that, I think, regardless of party or differences in direction and how to get there, I think drives everybody.
So just to get in the weeds a little bit on like the tactics of appealing to that broad base of humanity, when you first ran, you walked door to door for months on end. And in fact, every time I've ever heard you evaluate the readiness for someone to run for office, the first thing you ask them is, can you afford 3 pairs of shoes? Because that's how much you're going to be walking. Like, how much did you do in that kind of like direct community engagement?
Yeah, when you get into like the nuts and bolts of it, I mean, it really is building relationships with people. And I think that boils down to a couple different tactics. But throughout an entire election, if you think about it, in your average legislative district around the country, you're talking about tens of thousands of people on average. Some states are smaller, like Vermont and others, where it's hundreds of people in some cases. And then there's like California, where a legislative district is the size of, a small city, like 500,000 people plus. But generally, it's in the, like, let's say 20 to 100,000 person range. And that gives you the opportunity to be able to actually go out and meet people, because if you break it down by person, you have maybe like a minute, maybe 30 seconds that you'll be in that person's focus throughout an entire campaign season, whether it's on a TV ad or as they read a flyer that came in the mail or reading an email or even just taking all that stuff and throwing it away. They're going to be exposed to your brand and maybe one short snippet of some message you want to get across. And so how do you maximize that and build a relationship that will let them remember who you are, first of all, so that they go to vote and vote for you, and then also believe in what you're doing so they actually want to vote for you. And there's no easy way to do it. But what it really means is mailing a lot. So you got to raise some money. It means putting signs up throughout the community so people get some base name recognition. And then it means, to the extent you can, actually meeting people, either at community meetings, like you mentioned, going door to door. And when you have a district of, let's say, like 30,000 people or 50,000 people, you can actually do that. You can spend months literally walking from house to house, introducing yourself to people. And, even if you get like 10 seconds with someone before they slam the door in your face or, politely say, oh, thank you. Like, that's more than most people are ever going to get. Certainly, if you don't do that, it's 100% more than you'll ever get. But when people go to vote, they'll remember that one interaction they had, even if it was brief. And frankly, for like 9 out of 10 people, at least in my experience, and I think everyone I've talked to in elected office across the country, people aren't voting largely on the fundamentals of like what policy positions you're taking and what you're like promising to do and all this other stuff. For the most part, for the majority of people out there, they're voting because they remember you and they had at least not a negative emotional response to you. So if at the very least you can walk away having met someone and they're like, oh, okay, that's a decent person, then odds are they're going to vote for you when the time comes.
So you get elected, which for folks listening, Chris is running in Hawaii, which is a predominantly Democratic state. So our elections really take place in the primaries. Although I know you well enough to know that you never assume that you're going to win just because you've won the primary. And I also acknowledge that Chris is recording this interview with us just like 2 weeks from the general elections.
Yeah, you might have to change my introduction. I could be former senator.
I know, shoot. I have faith in you. You can knock on wood, but I believe. So you get elected. Here you are. How old are you when you got elected?
It's 27.
So you're 27 years old. You get elected. You are, if not the youngest, one of the youngest
I was the
representatives.
youngest at the time.
You were the youngest. Let's be clear, not anymore.
Definitely not anymore.
So, and you didn't strike me as like someone who came into this as an ideological warrior. You know, if I ran for office, everybody would know I had an agenda. It seemed like your agenda.
Save the world. It's not a terrible agenda, just for the record.
Yeah. So what, like, when did the bug bite you? When you realize, like, not only am I going to do this and lead, but I'm going to lead on a set of issues that are going to be transformational for the future of Hawaii.
You know, there was no, so the thing was, I never imagined I'd win. So when I was running this first election, like, I intentionally was not thinking about, like, all right, what comes after the election, other than I'm going to take some time off and go sit on a beach somewhere and recover.
You're still waiting to do that, eh?
I know. It's been 15 years and it's coming. But I think it was such a surprise and a shock when I did win that I didn't know what to do. And there's certainly stuff I cared about that I had like a lot of passion for, but you know, well, let me back up. I had originally ran after like months of cajoling, and I did it convincing myself that, all right, if I do this, I'm going to talk about three things, or I'm going to want to work on three things. One is LGBT issues, because at the time that wasn't like politically sexy at all. It wasn't cool. It was still a dangerous political topic, but one that's like so fundamentally important when it comes to basic equality and rights and family and all that. And so that was one. Climate, which at least where we were at the time, it was like dangerous to talk about as well, because you have these big landowners and developers who didn't want to have any sort of regulation, or have, especially if they're, you know, on the shoreline, they don't have to deal with what it means if you're doing climate policy that could change the way that we manage our shorelines and deal with sea level rise and everything like that. And then energy, because, you know, fossil fuels is just like so like 1895. We can probably do better, guys. And it just seemed like such an obvious thing. And we know where that future is. You know, I like to think that there's definitely that I'm an optimist. I think there's that future out there, like, you know, some decades down the road. For me, it's just a question of how do we get there? It's going to happen inevitably, whether we like it or not, but it's going to happen either a long ways away with a lot of pain and suffering and cost, or we're going to change policy and make it happen a lot more quickly at a lot more benefit for the community as a whole. So I kind of imagined I'd play some role in those things. And it was only after I got in that I realized, like, actually I have, as a brand new elected official who has no idea what's going on and really no seniority or ability to influence anything, for the first like 3 years, I did absolutely nothing, despite trying and feeling like I was pushing a boulder uphill that just had no ability to ever get anywhere. So it was actually a kind of a big letdown for me.
In the beginning,
yeah. And that only changed actually 3 years in. So I was 30 years old, and I was at a community meeting giving a talk. And it was actually,
by the way, I'm remembering when you came to my 30th birthday party, which was a food policy birthday party. So anyway, go on.
I hope the food was good.
Yeah, it was. Of course it was. Do you remember Taste in Kaka'ako? Like a rotating pop-up restaurant.
I do. I was giving a talk at a community meeting, and it was actually recorded. I gotta go see if I can dig up the recording of this. But anyway, I'm in the middle of my talk and I start getting a headache, and I start like seeing like spotty stuff in my vision. And long story short, ended up having a stroke. Like at 30 years old, I had no predisposition or idea that this was possible even. And I remember I was in the I stumbled out of the community. I wrapped up what I was talking about. And I stumbled out of the community meeting, thinking I was going to go home and go to sleep because I just had like a massive headache or was dehydrated or something. And got in my car and I started to drive. And like within, seconds, kind of lost motor control and just coasted off the road. And so I was just super lucky. The next driveway happened to be a fire station. There happened to be an EMS crew that had just pulled in to have dinner. And there was a couple girls walking across this parking lot coming from a basketball court nearby, I think, who found me because I was like having trouble trying to open the door to the car. It's like I couldn't quite get it done. And so I kind of flopped out onto the pavement. So anyway, I was in the hospital for about a week and wasn't quite sure what the prognosis was going to be, or I wasn't really like coherent in the beginning and didn't understand what was coming. So I remember after a couple of days of sitting in the hospital, waiting for tests and endless test results to come back, thinking like, I don't know if I'm going to actually recover. And at that point, I wasn't like fully functional or anything. And so I thought, well, this is the end of my life as I know it. Then, wow, I regret these last like 3 years of running for office and serving because, what if I got the show for it, right? And like all these people put their faith and trust in me to do something. And in those 3 years, like I couldn't get anything done. And I much rather, not only feeling like I let them down, but I much rather would have spent that time with family or friends or traveling the world or doing stuff if I had known that I only had 3 years left in my life. So it was incredibly depressing. And I remember like, and sitting in the same bed, like in a hospital, the days turned into like weeks. And it's just painful, like existing in your own head, thinking about the could have beens and the what ifs. And finally, I had this moment where it actually all came together and it completely flipped around. And I realized, it was when I realized that had I not run, then some other guy, actually the guy who's running against me, would have got in, and whom at the time I from a policy perspective totally disagreed with, and I think would have been much worse for our community and certainly for the issues that I cared about. So for me, the realization was that like I did this, and that's the most anybody in that position could have done. So I stopped bad stuff from happening, even though I wasn't in a place yet where I could change big things. And that is huge in and of itself. And so there was value in what I did. And that made me realize that, all right, if I ever get out of the hospital, I never want to be in a position in my life again where I regret the time that I had and how I spent it, especially if I'm going to be continuing to stay in office and do these things. So I promised myself, like, all right, if this works out and I get out of here, I'm going to do whatever I feel is the right thing to do. Politics be damned. If I get unelected, I get unelected. I don't care, because if I get unelected, it means I tried and I did as much as I could. And with that, I'd have no regrets and the ability to sleep at night for the rest of my life. And I'd much rather have that than have compromised along the way some core values, feeling like, you know what, I'm trying to just stick around or get reelected or raise money or whatever. And it's just not worth it.
So what do you feel like your first big win was? I mean, I'm hearing you come back from your stroke with no short-term memory. I can speak to this. I remember you in those early years. You were almost as forgetful as I am now. But you come with a zest and like a commitment to making the most of your life. And you start to have the capacity inside of the legislature to lead, because for those who are listening, as you move your way up the food chain, you get to be the head of committees that matter to you. You get to move bills through because you have more relationships. What do you think your first big policy win was? And what did it take for you to get there?
To your point about how those things function, it's so important for people to understand this, because it's not like you're just in office. And this is true in any state house around the country, in any city council, or even in Congress. Just by virtue of being there doesn't mean that you're building seniority to be effective. You certainly figure out and learn some lessons along the way. And yeah, you might get like a bigger office when somebody, more senior retires or whatever. But by and large, you really have to work at it, and you really have to be strategic and build relationships, not only with folks in the community who can come in and help you, but with colleagues also, and so on. And so it's a ton of work. But the biggest thing was just figuring out how the process worked, and that took me probably like 4 or 5 years to really go through the process of trying to introduce, write, and pass bills, organize the community, organize stakeholders to come in and testify and support them, to figure out how to neutralize opposition, how to message to the public and the news media to get the story out there, and then how to turn that coalition into an effective, army to do something. It is an incredible skill set that I don't think anybody has going into this. You kind of learn it the hard way along the way. But that put me in a position more than anything to be able to help be effective. And then also I was part of a group of, like-minded individuals who wanted to do more. And we sort of grouped together and exercised our collective strength to put ourselves in positions in the legislature. And I ended up as chair of the Energy and Environmental Protection Committee. So that meant all the policy related to energy and environment stuff would come to my committee, and I'd have to make decisions on these bills and vote them out or amend them or what have you. And that is where I think the first big opportunity came to do something. And I think the biggest policy change is probably on the energy front. We passed a bill that I helped put together with some outside organizations and school groups, actually, and it made Hawaii the first state to commit and mandate 100% clean energy by 2045 on the electric grid. That means getting rid of fossil fuels and coal and oil and gas and all that stuff. And it was a game changer. It had never been done before anywhere. And I think that was just such a huge, for me, personal victory and revelation that wow, you put in all this time and you go through the process and you engage people and build these coalitions and everything. You can actually do really, really cool stuff.
So we had a really great conversation with a woman that was working on climate policy at the city level. And I'm wondering if you can help us understand the makeup of an effective coalition for change and why policy and advocacy are so important. I can put solar on my house. If I have access to that kind of capital, I can screw in my LED lights. Why do we need to parlay our climate anxiety into policy activism?
I think this is true in any issue area, but climate in particular. We are creatures of habit, and we have a daily routine. We build ourselves as individuals and as families, our little corner of the world, and we kind of live there. And it's very, very difficult to disrupt that in any real way. There are reasons why you might do it yourself. For example, you want to save some money, so you're going to get off of you're going to trade up your Hummer for maybe a Prius or something like that. But by and large, the kinds of change that people want, which everybody wants, right? Lower cost of living, cleaner air, healthier environment, better schools for our kids, all these things, we demand change as a society. When you ask people, what are you doing about it yourself? The answer is often not much. And there's that cognitive dissonance and disconnect there. That means often not only are we fighting against that, but then we also have established industries in every sector that are making money and have been doing things the same way they're doing them, and they have command of their own little fiefdom part of the economy that they're capitalizing off of. And change also means often disruption in the business world, and industries that have a ton of money in our political system in the US have the ability to influence policy significantly. And you can go back to, for example, the dawn of cars. Our communities all used to be walkable communities. You didn't have to pay tens of thousands of dollars a year to own a car to get to work. Automakers intervened and actually bought up public transit systems and shut them down so that people will be forced to buy cars. Talk about a change in your life that now is commonplace and kind of the status quo, but didn't exist. And it was influenced by these kinds of actors. So when you think about like changing now into something different, you need to overcome the personal inertia. You need to overcome the industrial and business inertia. And the only way you're going to do that effectively is by wholesale change. Yeah, you can get some CFLs or LED light bulbs into homes. There's a lot of programs that do that. There's a lot of people who do it themselves. But by and large, you're not going to change a significant enough portion of the population fast enough to actually make a difference unless you help prod it along. And that means a policy change that drives business in a different direction. So you have different products, and so that people adopt different standards and ultimately have a better quality of life.
Yeah, I think I really realized this in the pesticide debate, when it was like, sure, I can avoid pesticides through my personal shopping practices. I can buy organic, but only the government can stop an agricultural operation from spraying noxious pesticides during the school day and having those pesticides drift through the open windows of our school. That is the proper role of government action and policy. And I think a lot of folks are alienated from government because it does feel really broken. And yet, government regulation continues to play this really important role in public health and environmental protection.
It does. And I think what people also don't realize or often forget, especially in the frustration of everything going on in the world, is that government isn't like some homogenous giant institution that you just can't influence. There's different levels of government, right? We look at Congress and DC and we get frustrated and we're like, those guys aren't doing anything. And usually they're not. But there's also state governments and there's local governments that control all the things that are important to your life. Like when you wake up in the morning, you get up, you go outside, you get in your car, what that road's going to look like and where it goes to get you where you want to go is decided by your local city or county government. What schools your kids go to, what kind of healthcare you have access to is often, for the most part, decided by your state governments. You have all kinds of environmental regulations that are put in place, like to keep pesticides out of schools and out of kids' playgrounds. When you think about like the urban core where people live, do you have access to public parks and clean air? All these things that account for like 90% of your day, including what kind of jobs you have access to, what kind of pay you might have access to, whether or not your bosses can just unilaterally fire you because they feel like it, or whether you have some basic rights and protections in place. That's all decided by people that you can elect. And circling back to the beginning of this conversation, when you have districts that are the sizes of like, tens of thousands of people, your vote is huge. We've seen countless elections across the country decided every single election by literally less than 10 votes. Mm-hmm. This many votes can make the difference. In some cases, there have been ties where someone flips a quarter because it's that close. So to think that like you were the one person who decided not to vote that year, I mean, and then, everything goes south because of that. Like, yeah, that's because your vote matters that much. And I think that's where people can actually get involved and make a difference and understand that this isn't just some like, throwing your vote away or yelling at the man down over in DC or something like that, but rather this is truly empowered government, empowered by you and what effort and influence you put into it.
So let's talk a little bit about the ways that people can participate in this process, because we're holding it up as necessary in this moment. We can lean on the transformational victories that you yourself have helped sort of lead, including Hawaii's commitment to 100% renewable energy. But there's this very murky policy process that we're glossing over. Because as somebody who's been a citizens lobbyist, it's complicated. and it's time consuming. So what does that look like? I mean, yeah, people can run, but some people aren't going to run. But like, how can they be effective advocates at the state legislature or even the city council?
When I was first elected, I was kind of blown away because you get a call, the day after the election. They're like, all right, congratulations. Here's logistically what needs to happen next. We're going to assign you a parking stall. You're going to get an office, staff, come down to the Capitol. There's an orientation, training. So you show up a few days later. And I remember walking into this room with some of the other newly elected folks, and they sat us down and they did this whole spiel about, all right, we're going to talk about how a bill becomes law and how this process works. We have a video for you. And it was like a 1970s Schoolhouse Rock video of like the bill going up to Capitol Hill. I'm just a bill. Like that was the beginning of our training. And I thought like, oh my God, like, is it serious? But it actually is.
Make sure that's in the show notes. Let's be sure the Schoolhouse Rock video.
Yeah, but it actually is that simple. And I think what people forget though in that process, and that the reason it looks so murky and opaque and just inaccessible to everyone, is because people don't know what role they can play in that. And there's the obvious ones, right? You can run for office, which 99 out of 100 people are not going to do, and that's fine, because I think there is a role for everybody. It's figuring out which one is yours, because there's not just the folks who run for office. There's the staff, like I used to be, behind the scenes, doing a lot of the policy work, doing the research. There's the community organizers who are the ones out there saying, hey, you know what? These are the issues that we ought to care about. Let's organize and get people engaged in the process. There's organizations that are looking at all these different issues, from climate to food to women's rights, and on and on and on. Each of them has their own thing they want to help accomplish, and they need people engaged there the same. And then there's folks who are actually just coming up with ideas themselves, like waking up one day. And this is the whole reason why I realized change was actually possible. I was actually an intern right after college at the state capitol, and I was doing that internship to get my credit to graduate. And I was manning the front desk for a representative, just answering the phone, that kind of thing. And a guy walked in, older gentleman, and he said, oh, I come from this community down the way called Kaka'ako, which is kind of waterfront in Honolulu. But it's where a bunch of like really accessible surf spots are, and kind of notable. And he said, hey, there's this big development. They're going to put up a bunch of residential towers right on the water, and it's going to block the community's access to the ocean. We can't let this happen. So I thought, okay, great. I've read about this in the paper. It's like a multi-billion-dollar project or something. Let me take your name and number. I'll pass it on. I thought to myself, like, okay, I'll just pass it on. That'll be the end of that. And a week or two later, the guy comes back again with one or two of his neighbors and says, hey, we just want to follow up. Can we meet with the representative? And I take their information again. Fast forward a couple months, and this guy had gone out and organized his community, got some of the surfers involved, got a bunch of the local neighborhood organizations, and they were leading marches of thousands of people from their area, partway across the city to the state capitol. This was on the front page of the papers. It was in the news on a daily basis. And the state legislature that year changed the law to prohibit that development from going forward, and at the same time, ensure public access to those beachfront areas in perpetuity, forever. I mean, and that started with this guy who was just frustrated and had an idea. And I thought, like, wow, if this guy can do this, at his age, surely my friends and I, who have all kinds of gripes with society, can do something too. And that's one of those roles where people can get involved.
I mean, something that I've learned with you as the sort of community organizer counterpoint is just how much legislators rely on lobbyists and community groups for their work. And I don't mean lobbyist in the like creepy corporate. It's anybody who's there to influence an issue is to some respect a lobbyist. So even in our work, me helping you understand, this is what the medical literature on pesticide exposure is, helping connect you with doctors and experts in the field.
And by the way, for the folks listening, Ashley's efforts on pesticides over the last 10 years or so were amazing, to the point where she organized the community, got a bunch of folks engaged, and ultimately was able to change the law, which made Hawaii the first state to ban one of the most toxic pesticides. Yeah, say that 10 times fast. Chlorpyrifos. Chlorpyrifos? I still don't know.
It's a debate.
Years. Yeah, the debate rages on. But it's responsible for like 10,000 deaths around the world per year, and is highly toxic. And Hawaii became the first state to ban that, thanks to the organizing that Ashley and others did, and the legislature being able to rely on that community support to ultimately go against the wishes of these big corporate interests. And now that was a template that was adopted by other states around the country, and has completely changed the whole debate around pesticides and its impacts that are being seen in communities everywhere. I mean, and that started with people like Ashley.
And I'll just lay out a little bit so people have a sense of how we did this, right? Like, Chris would have a hearing in his committee. Chris would also introduce the bill. So we need to work with our legislators to introduce bills that are important. We need to work with those legislators to understand when our hearings are, right? Because every bill goes through several committee hearings. And you and I would use those committee hearings as like an act of political theater. It was and the reason we didn't go in like, we need to ban this pesticide. We decided to frame the legislation as you can't spray pesticides near schools, so that we would force these industry representatives to come into a hearing and testify opposing that. And it sort of helped us change the debate at the time, where our side was being framed as sort of like anti-technology and anti-progress in agriculture. And by working with legislators like yourself, we changed the issue to, this is about the safety of our children. Same exact legislative goal, but very different strategies that really actually changed the framing of the entire debate. And I don't think you could have done that alone, right? You needed doctors to show up at the hearings. You needed directly impacted families to show up, which I think we both acknowledge is massively inconvenient for these folks to do, given the way at least our legislature works.
Yeah, definitely.
And yet,
and that it was still possible because of that organizing capacity. Yeah, no, totally. I mean, nobody in any, I've talked with legislators from all 50 states at this point, I'm pretty sure, or worked with in some capacity, Republicans, Democrats, independents, and the story is the same everywhere. Legislators can only do what they're politically empowered to do. So if you're in a state where people are like protesting against you in significant number, you're going to have a really hard time convincing your elected colleagues to go vote for this thing, because it's wildly unpopular and doesn't make sense on the merits. And if you can control that and at least seed that debate and frame conversations so that those odds are in your favor, that changes everything. But that means reaching out to experts out in the community and building that public support.
Yeah, I think that was the thing that I realized going back to my own elementary civics education, because although I have a PhD in political science, I did not study the policy process.
See, this is where you went wrong. You didn't see the bill on Capitol Hill video. That could have saved you like an entire degree.
I know. 7 years of my life wasted. But I had this realization that, here we are working on these issues in our community, and in an increasingly narrowed media landscape. And we've had quite a few interviews on the podcast with different journalists that are really just talking about how the consolidation of our media landscape is driving the degradation of our communities because we don't have anybody to do storytelling. There is an incredibly effective PR vehicle in the legislative process, because if you can get a legislator to introduce a bill on your issue, you immediately attract attention of just like a much broader swath of the community. And I think that's something that you've done really well, is use your office to change conversations about complex issues. And that the hearing process, the way that the bill moves through the legislature, just becomes these interval opportunities to really frame out the conversation. So it wasn't, 100%, it wasn't like ban fossil fuels. It was 100% clean energy. It was like something we could all work towards, rather than recognizing it's also a battle against. It was a fight for healthy schools for children, not a battle against agrochemical corporations that are poisoning our islands.
Right. And yeah, that same framework applies to so many other issues, including a bunch that are, we're in the midst of battling right now. It's always how do you frame it right so people can understand and digest it? And for the folks who are going to oppose, make them oppose something that is just mom and apple pie.
Something you and I have had a lot of like strategy differences on is how strong can you be in your, like, I'm trying to think of a better way to frame this. Like, how incendiary can you be? And
as an elected official?
As a community activist, I mean, you are a coalition builder. This is your strength. This is your success. You do a really good job strategizing on the inside game and helping me realize how I can bring the largest group of legislators along. And that is what policy making requires, particularly if you're on the offensive and the creative path, and not just killing bad bills.
Yeah,
like,
there's a good cop, bad cop thing that goes on. And it's true both like in the inside outside game for elected officials who tend to want to be good cop, to have partners in the community who are screaming bloody murder about some issue, obviously helps, right? Helps situation. The peeling back, I think, the veneer of politics and all that, because we all hear the loud voices on the news and social media and everything else. But if you notice, that is a necessary role that is played, but is often, they're not the same voices that actually end up changing whatever it is they're talking about. So a good example, like where you have in any elected body, legislature, Congress, city council, you'll tend to have a couple of really outspoken folks, like really outspoken. And that's one role that they choose to play. But if you think about it, there's another role, which is sort of that quiet, like, all right, more pragmatic, how are we going to come together and actually solve this role too, which is also necessary. And they're two separate roles. You can't do both at the same time. I think this goes back to the dawn of like democracy. And if you think about it, everybody has experience sitting in a classroom growing up. And there's going to be that one kid who's like going on and on about something. Like, okay, yeah, he might have a point, but is he typically going to be the one that actually does something about it? Like, no, he brings attention to something important. But then you have a consensus or a bigger coalition that ends up changing something at the end of the day. And that's basically how democracy works, because that's how psychology works. Not everyone's going to get behind someone who's like screaming bloody murder, which is why the loudest people in Congress, like right now, for example, it's the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and folks like that who are constantly in the news for usually like just ridiculous things, getting attention. They're not going to be the ones to do the coalition building. So you have to kind of pick and choose what your role is going to be in elected office. And then to the same degree, figure out who you're going to partner with in the community, because there are also those roles for those organizations that are doing the community organizing, that are getting engaged. You might not want someone who's super outspoken on an issue tactically, because that might alienate some supporters. You might need to pull into a coalition to get enough votes to pass something. You have to be very deliberate and very conscious, which is why I think actually some of the greatest skill sets aren't, and maybe actually you can speak to this, it's not going to be like a degree in political science, which I also have, although mine's just a regular, I think, bachelor BS.
Big
BS.
things happened in the extra 7 years, let me tell you.
I'm sure I'm missing a lot, but it's how do you think critically? It's how do you read people, and how do you think ahead a few steps? I mean, it's essentially like chess plus poker. If you can read your colleagues and then think ahead, you'll be in much better shape than someone who walks in brand new with just a regular degree and whatever.
Well, it's interesting, a big theme of this podcast for me as the host is how invaluable peopling skills are. We've talked to community organizers that have transformed their sector, and they will say, like, you cannot give up the need to really be able to connect with people and have hard conversations and bring people along and share information on hard issues. And I think one of the effects of social media is that we're losing our political operating system to those frameworks. And we think that somehow we're going to get as far as we want to go because we can organize on Facebook or Instagram. And it's like, no, those are the icing on the organizing cake. You're going to have to be able to go in and change legislators' minds. I mean, that's been the hard part for me, is you actually do have to run vote counts and see who do I have in my pocket, and who do I need to earn, and what's the number, who can I neutralize? There is a chessboard that has to be played if you want to pass something. And I want to make this clear to everybody that there's two ways to do policy. There's defensive policy, which is organizing communities to stop bad things. And I would say that is easier, far easier than building a coalition to pass something that's really going to change the fabric of our community. And that longer strategy, it just requires a lot of people skills, a lot of relationship building, a lot of inside politics.
I think people have to trust others around them, that if they work together on something, they're not going to get burned by it in any way. And I think there's two really good examples also of this. We had a situation at the Capitol in Hawaii. We're facing a difficult issue. It was around same-sex marriage at the time, which was this is 2013. It was horrifically controversial and divisive. We had tens of thousands of people showing up to the Capitol to testify, saying we really don't want this, or we really do want this. And there was one element of it where we had a hearing, and there were there's these forum emails that came in, and someone had been out on social media on Facebook or something, just putting it out there, and all these people were angry, and they sent in all these forum testimonies against this thing. And at one point I remember thinking wow, this is a lot of people. This is kind of difficult. This could be difficult the next time we have to go out and talk about an issue in the community, or certainly the next election. And we had a community meeting, and almost nobody showed up. Nobody showed up because talking with some of the few folks who did, they're where is everybody? Where's our army who's angry? And it was because it's just social media. Nobody took the next step of then actually engaging, calling a legislator, keeping in touch with each other, even so that when there was that next community meeting, they could all show up, and they knew to show up. And then the funniest thing, the next election, everybody who voted for same-sex marriage that was supposed to lose ended up winning. And one person who voted against it, who was supposed to win, ended up losing. And we went and talked with some of the folks after the fact who were real opponents. And it was from one particular religious community. And come to find out, they basically said, well, we don't vote. We don't get engaged in that way. This is against our religion. We just advocate. And I was wow, there's a huge disconnect there. The other one, I was just in Glasgow this past November at the United Nations Annual Climate Conference, COP27. And there's this, massive security barriers. You have to walk through like 3 security walls with like armed guards and the whole deal just to get inside, because all the world leaders are there, from president of the United States to prime minister of the UK and so on and so on. And outside, there are these rallies of like hundreds of thousands of people spurred on by Greta Thunberg and these climate youth from Europe and from around the world. And I remember on the inside, I'd be there on behalf of our state, cutting deals with other subnational governments on clean energy and where we're going to invest and how to change our policies to achieve better climate results. And then I'd take my tie off, walk outside, and like join the protests in the afternoon. Hold a sign saying, "You guys aren't doing it fast enough." But what's so amazing about that is these are world leaders. They come from all these different countries. The people who show up to protest are not necessarily their constituents, or not from these same places where these world leaders are. And so on the inside of the security barriers, it felt like there was no one on the outside. Like no amount of yelling and screaming and pressure out there felt like it was going to move the needle at all on the inside on this issue, because while people were out there, they were not organized in a way that was meaningful. What's meaningful, which we kind of talked with a few of the folks about afterwards, if you were to go home, all these world leaders and everybody goes back to their own countries, and the protests happened there on their own doorstep from people who vote for them or could kick them out of office, man, that is powerful. That would change things significantly in ways that even if you had like 1,000 people show up to a state house in some capital of some state in the US, that is huge. Having 100,000 people at this conference in Glasgow, where there's no real connection between the crowd outside and the leaders on the inside, kind of meaningless. Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. Those people are awesome for standing up and doing a lot of stuff. Good on them for getting engaged. Just tactically, there are ways to do that in addition to what they're doing. They certainly got the world press focused on the issue and all that. Awesome. But now, like, we got to take the next step, right? How do you connect those people to the leaders in their home places where they can actually make a much more significant difference?
Yeah, I mean, on an issue that we're both organizing right now around access to psychedelics, I mean, here is this issue that I'm working on, which for all intents and purposes, publicly, like coming out of the pesticide and GMO fight, which was understood as divisive, psychedelics, I don't know one person who's against expanding access to psychedelics for mental health care. And yet, and you go to these events and they sell out. I mean, every Zoom event, we've got hundreds of registrants at this in-person event, sold out, 150 plus people. And then you tell people, but in order for us to do this, you're going to have to engage the government. Only the government can provide doctors safe pathways to provide these medicines in their clinic. So you're going to have to participate in the legislative process. And my attitude is, yeah, and it's a pain in the ass. Yeah, and it's a lot of work. And that's where I think people miss. They want that. I think the internet has provided the facade of ease in activism. And actually, real social and political change takes dedication. It takes time. Like, I don't think Rosa Parks could have put an online petition and made the change that she made through her form of civil disobedience. So I just really want to honor, in order to make legislative change, there is a certain kind of organizing that's necessary. And it is an and, not an or. Yes, we need protests. Yes, we need moments of collective recognition where we see we're a part of a movement that's much bigger than ourselves. But if we want to move leadership, it's actually more impactful to start to build your grid of influence locally, Yeah,
absolutely. I think, we're at a point where people are starting to figure that out in a real way. Right? The angst in social media and online and all that is finally turning into something meaningful, because there are tools now to organize people to take that next step, right? So yeah, go be angry online, go sign a petition, but then follow up with the organization that's helping to organize that, so that when there's that next community meeting or that opportunity to submit testimony because a decision is going to be made, then those people know to re-engage. And that's something we're starting to see. So I'm like super optimistic about this. I think, the kind of engagement, which is sort of gateway, which is like that, how do you make your voice heard online, is turning into those concrete next steps. And I think that's where we all win, because there's roles for everybody in that process. You don't have to run for office to do it. You don't have to be like the organizer. You could be someone who gets one or two other people, your neighbors, involved. You could be someone who just shows up to a hearing, or just phones it in, says, hey, I want to talk to my elected official. This is important to me. Here's who I am. Can you help? And if you do that en masse, then you have dozens of people. And here's the secret. I think legislators and congressmen, they're all people too. On a really controversial issue, it doesn't take that many people to have a big impact. Like, often we're dealing with issues that are significant, but you might hear from like 20 people. And 20 people, by and large, is like, that's serious. That means something's going on in the community where people are starting to pay attention. And, if you could be one of those 20 or help organize like 5 others, that's how much of an impact you can have. Because legislators just don't want to deal with, like, elected officials just don't want to deal with like angry people. You acknowledge, like, you're never going to make everyone happy. Sure, there's going to be some upset people, but if you can avoid it, you'll try and do something to avoid that and help craft some sort of compromise or whatever it is. So that's where folks can really get engaged and meaningfully shift what's happening around them.
I think the other thing that I've really noticed, at least in Hawaii, is like doing your homework on the relationships that exist inside of the elected body, right? Like, there is factionalization beyond parties, and doing the research to kind of understand the landscape of power inside of a elected body helps you to understand how you can plug in. I many times will bring you an idea and say, oh, and I heard from this legislator and they'll introduce the bill, and you'll be like, don't do that. Don't have that person be the emissary of your cause. So, like, how do you recommend people understand that part of the legislative process?
I think that's where it takes a concerted effort to organize, right? So if you want to get something done in any decision-making body at any elected level in the country, you got to know, to your point, who you're dealing with, because some legislators, there's a spectrum, right? Not only from the political spectrum of left to right or Republican to Democrat and all that, but also like people who are truly engaged in the process, elected officials that are engaged. Some elected officials are checked out because they're focused on the business they're running, or whatever else. So you need to know the right people who are in the right places to do that kind of work, and who have, I think, often the respect of colleagues or others, where their voice, if they say we should do this, people will actually listen and not just tune them out like some others that we tend to hear on the news on a regular basis. So figuring that out, though, is not something that's easy to do. That's where I think the power of organizing comes together. So if you are wanting to change something, figure out who those other organizations or other people are that are already working on that issue and team up. Because if there's an organization working on it, community organization or a nonprofit or what have you, they probably have been doing enough of this outreach and work that they can say, yep, these are the people who are allies. Here are the people who are not. Here's how we ought to proceed. And if you can have one of those champions in elected office who truly believes in that cause, and usually there's somebody somewhere, you can use them as a sounding board to sort of, get some intel and figure out what those next steps ought to be. But so for the average person, don't think like you have to figure 100% of this out. It's figuring out where you fit into the organizing and the group of people who are working on this issue.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, I'm thinking about all the sort of landscape of collaboration that exists in Hawaii. And, there are those groups that can really help you map where the different legislative factions are. I think there are those groups that work in an interconnected way, right? Just teaching people how to navigate the legislative process, give good testimony. And then I do think, deciding what legislators you can build sort of deep long-term relationships with on the issues that matter to you, and like really meeting legislators first as people and as colleagues and as friends, and then kind of figuring out where your professional ambitions intersect.
Yeah, and I think the mistake people make often is they get so frustrated immediately because things don't change overnight. They often burn bridges. And elected officials are people too, right? So if you have somebody just screaming profanities at you, you're gonna take a step back and work with somebody who's a little more put together. And the funny thing about elected office is there's always an election coming up, and there's always going to be elected officials. So often, if that same person that was frustrating you gets reelected, guess who you're working with the next time around? The same person. So it's important, even if you disagree, I think, to figure out how to do that in a way that doesn't make you a pariah or burn that bridge, so that you won't be able to effectively work on something. And there is a role for that sometimes, like no question. Elected officials that are doing bad stuff or sometimes not doing things they ought to be should be called out for it from time to time, no question. But in the process of doing so, you got to figure out, all right, what is the strategy to actually work around that to get something done? Do we work with other people? Do we build votes? Do we really need that person's vote? How do we plan? And that's where I think having that collective organized effort where you have different organizations who are plugged into the system, you can get people who just want to do something, let them figure out what they're passionate about and how best for them they're comfortable getting involved, and then working together. Because you can iron all this stuff out and figure out strategy when you're there. But it is difficult sometimes to work with people who are just don't really want to work well, and they just demand something that is sometimes impossible to do just because it takes time sometimes to do things. So
can you tell me, I know we're almost out of time, but I'm wondering if you can talk about loss. Like, how do you said 9 times out of 10, you're not going to get what you want. And then on the 10th, you finally get it. Like, how do you build fortitude inside of yourself to stay the course? Like, why have you not given up?
Because if I do give up, then nothing's going to change. You get half a loaf sometimes, and victories can be few and far between. It's still worth it to do because each one of those can impact so many people and so many issues. I mean, looking back, I've been so fortunate to have worked with a lot of people and figured out smarter people around me, both in the community and in the workplace, to work with, who can make these things possible that either I want to do or I want to work with other people to do together. And it's been, now those things I talked about before, when it comes to LGBT issues, like we not only legalized same-sex marriage and normalized, I think, communication with the general public, but we've been working on protections for transgender individuals, barring people from being discriminated against by health insurance companies, from just providing basic dignity and the same level of respect in society as anyone else. Those are all laws that I was able to push through working with these collaborative groups. On climate, I mean, we made Hawaii the first state to commit to 100% clean energy. We made Hawaii the first state after that to commit to a zero emissions economy, and did a dozen other things on clean transportation and sea level rise and adaptation that no one else had been doing. I mean, it's just been incredibly just fulfilling. And then on basically every issue area, we've worked together to achieve some of that stuff on ensuring protections for women, that they can not have, guys like me in elected office deciding what they can do with their own bodies and what's going to happen if they're raped, and just all kinds of great stuff. And, those victories are the kinds of things that in retrospect, looking back, make years of working on some of those things. And some took, like pesticides. That was like 7-8 years of work. Fail to finally win in a big way. And that's something that I think in any campaign in the history of this country, in any sort of change, social, political, whatever. It took that kind of sustained effort over many, many years, sometimes many generations, to achieve. And if we give up so easily, then it'll never happen. And those things that are worth changing, of course, are going to be worth fighting for and worth failing for and getting up again.
Yeah, I think that's where I would just say, like, it sounds like for you, every failure is just a part of the path to success. And like, you really do keep the long view that, like Martin Luther King says, like, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Like, we can actually get to where we want to go. We just have to commit to not giving up.
That's exactly it. Podcast done.
There we go. Podcast is done. The Hero's Journey is brought to you by the Center for Food Safety. Production by Julia Ranney and Ashley Lukens. Editing and social media by Amanda Lillibridge, Duray Shin, and Annalisa Camacho. Theme song by Walker Lukens and Adam Mason, and audio engineering by Adam Mason. You can find us across all podcast platforms and follow us at Center for Food Safety on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, and CFS True Food on Twitter. We're on the web at theheroesjourneypodcast.com. Do you have a hero you'd like to see on the podcast? Fill out the form in the show notes or email us at theheroesjourneypod@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, like and subscribe, and make sure you'll never miss an episode. We'll see you in a few weeks.